Hello everyone and welcome back to the third and final episode of this three-part mini-series about the historic gas plant in Turner Valley, Alberta, Canada. In this episode we are touring the entire plant with all the buildings and machinery, guided by a very knowledgeable tour guide, sharing the history of this plant with us. Hopefully you enjoyed this mini-series. Leave us a comment, let us know, provide some feedback, and please don't forget to like, subscribe and share. And you can also support us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/KassDays. Again, hopefully you enjoyed this. Let us know. And let's get into this. Thank you very much for watching and supporting us.
And those engines were used to generate electricity on site. So that's when we started calling it the light plant, because the electricity kept the lights on. And then in '63, it became just a storage sulfur plant, 1952. That's actually incorrect. The sign should be on that metal corrugated building. The cinder block building is what we call the steam plant. So I mentioned inside that we used steam in our processes and to run a lot of our equipment on site. So that was the steam generating plant, the cinder block one. The sulfur plant was put in 1952. It was the second one in Canada by just a couple of weeks. So fairly significant historic site there. The sulfur plant would have produced molten sulfur that they then poured into molds that would have been behind that building. Then those molds would have been broken up into small pieces and bagged, put in like paper bags and shipped out by truck. Eventually, as time went on, when we're getting into the 70s, probably we're to a point where tanker trucks are able to transport molten sulfur. So at that point, then they would load molten sulfur into the trucks. Welding shop. They were put in the 50s and 60s. As you can imagine, with all the moving parts here, we would need a machinist and a welder on site so that we would have someone at our disposal if we needed something repaired or replaced. I am told that the gentlemen that held these positions were masters at their craft. You could come to them with something, a broken valve or something, and say, I need this in 3 hours. And they'd be like, right out. So way to that far corner. That's our compressor plant over there. The reason it's so spread out is in case of fire. So we talked about 1920, how that absorption building burned to the ground and they had to start over. But one of the things to note here is the fire protection system belonged to the plant. So you see the red fire hydrants?
Yeah.
If we had a fire on site, we would have to have one of the workers go to the far side of the plant. He would have to start up a pump that's by the river, way over on the other side of all of those buildings. Gives you an idea of what it looked like at that time period. This white kind of matter that's back here, we talked inside about them drilling and pulling that kind of sluice out of the hole using the baling tool.
Yeah.
They would pull that out and throw it out the back of the well. So that's what that is. It's just the rock that they're drilling with.
Okay. That's where it all started.
Yes, that valve right there. So that well was successfully abandoned, I believe, in the 60s, if memory serves me correctly. The province has gone in, and they put kind of a plastic bladder here to funnel that seepage into one spot so that it comes through that blue barrel, which is filled with charcoal. Then the gas goes from there through the piping that you see into that small compressor building, where it's burned and used to generate electricity that we sell back to the grid. So that's what this little setup is. If you look, when this is not running at full capacity, the gas is released to atmosphere. So you can see at the top of that T, it's not running right at the moment. It shuts down periodically for self-maintenance and that type of thing. So that gas right now is going straight to atmosphere. You can see it coming out.
Actually, you can see it coming out, yeah.
And in this case, it's naturally occurring. It's coming out of the ground with that kind of yucky, rotten, eggy smell. But when we produce natural gas and propane, there is no smell. It's odorless and colorless. So we add it back in. So when you smell natural gas, that's an additive. They call it stench, but the chemical term is ethyl mercaptan. Field and sending it, compressing it, sending it down the line for processing. So if they were to have some sort of incident where gas was released, there could be H2S in it, and that's why we wear the monitors. Again, the chances are very, very slim, but we are trained to handle it just in case, and we have the equipment.
So that's just naturally coming out, or they're still actively?
They are still actively drawing from the field with that compressor station. And then, of course, every station like that, you have a flare stack so that if something goes wrong in your process, then you have somewhere to send that gas and you can burn it off so you don't get pressure building up. More for you. It talks about Mr. Heron again, and we talked about how he lost everything and kind of sold to Royal Ag and moved on. One thing I like to point out is he still went on to be a very wealthy, successful businessman. He was well known in Calgary. If you watch the Calgary Stampede or the parade, you'll see there's always a car with the big, huge Texas Longhorns in the car.
Yes.
That belonged to his son.
Oh, really?
The white hat tradition from the Stampede.
Yeah.
His son is also responsible for going to the hat maker in the late 40s, early 50s and saying, "You're making all these bowler hats that nobody really wants to wear, and we need Stetsons. Start making Stetsons." So to this day, that company is the sole provider of those hats. So the building that is running left to right, the furthest building from us, that's a gasoline plant.
Okay.
Off of that gasoline plant, coming out at 90 degrees towards us, is the propane plant. So that's where propane would be processed, and we'll talk about that when we get a little closer. This building in front of us with all of the mufflers on it, that is the compressor station for the propane facility.
So when you say gasoline plant in the back there, that means they use crude oil and turned it into gasoline then?
This is absorption gasoline or condensate. So no crude oil was processed here, just the natural gas and that naphtha we talked about.
Okay.
So they're making absorption gasoline. It's an additive in the oil and gas industry. You add it to crude to make it more viscous.
Yeah.
So that's what absorption gasoline or condensate was used for, and that's the gasoline that they were producing here. Inside the building, there would be valves, very similar to the little valves you see on top of the tank behind us. And the thought was that if you pull this switch down, it would open that valve up and it would release some of the pressure in the process if we had something going wrong in the process. My husband worked here, and he said, he asked many times, "Have we ever tested these? Do we know if they work?" And the older fellows that worked here said, "Quit asking so many questions." So in theory, that is what those were for. Inside here, one of the most important parts of this section of the plant are those towers in front of us. They're called absorbers, the absorption plant. So there's 5 towers there. What happens is the gas comes in from the field, and it comes from below through piping, and it travels up into those towers. And inside we talked about the layers of bubble cap trays, layers and layers of trays. So those towers are filled with those trays. So the gas is traveling up from the bottom, and if you see the skinny pipes that are on the right-hand side that kind of go down into the top of that tower, through that pipe we would put a made-for-purpose product called lean oil. So we would put that in through the top.
Okay.
The lean oil is trickling down through those trays. The gas is coming up, and it's hitting those bubble caps and being forced through that lean oil. And lean oil has an affinity for hydrocarbons. So while it's going through, it's pulling all the hydrocarbons out of the gas.
So it's kind of purifying the gas, really.
It's pulling away those hydrocarbons, so C1, C2, C3, propane, butane, methane. It's pulling all of those pieces out. It's pulling it out as kind of a hydrocarbon soup, we like to say. And then from there, it is sent into this building for processing. And at this point, we've got this hydrocarbon soup, and then we put it through the gasoline plant and the propane plant, and we send it on to the butane.
Okay, so that soup ended up then
it ends up in here. And this is a kind of a distillation process. Not too bad. In that little shack over there, and he was responsible for running the propane part of the operation, producing propane in that end. So the propane plant actually was built across the river by a private company.
Okay.
And the gentleman tried to make a go of it for a couple of years, and for whatever reason, his company was failing. So once again, Morale said, well, how about we buy that? So they purchased it, they moved it both using propane.
I can only imagine how noisy, probably hot and smelly that was in
Very
here.
hot, very noisy, yeah. Very simple, there's no computers, there's no real technology here. This was built in 1933. It was built by a gentleman, the engineer's name was Sam Coltis. And he also was plant manager around that time period for a few years, but he's responsible for building and designing this part of the facility and the absorbers. He worked here during the Depression era, so it was said that he was always making sure the locals had food, and that the company would go to him and say, we know what you're doing, but they never asked him to stop. So it was said he was a big part of helping get the locals in the area through the Depression. Up until the Depression era, there would have been 2 shifts of workers in the plant, 12-hour shifts. But during the Depression, there were so many people camped outside the gate looking for work that Sam Coltis decided, okay, we're going to make 3 shifts of 8 hours. So things were changed so that we could have more workers and more employment available to people that needed it. So if you look at this facility, it was put in 1933. This side is the reverse mirror image. It was added 10 years later. And remember how we talked about amping up production in wartime?
Yeah.
That's likely why this was added on. But it's identical on either side, it's just reversed. Okay? So it was a distillation process. We had that oil that comes in from the absorbers that has all those hydrocarbons, our hydrocarbon soup. It would go into those 2 center tanks, which are distillation tanks.
Yeah.
It would be heated up, and that oil now would drop out of it, and our hydrocarbons would be at the top. So our propane, butane, methane, all of those would be at the top for us to scoop off. And now that oil, when it came to the bottom here full of hydrocarbons, it would be called rich oil. When we put it in, it was lean oil. Now we've boiled those hydrocarbons out of it, and we're going to send them through this process. So we've got that lean oil back again because we've removed the hydrocarbons. So that lean oil would go from these tanks back into some pumps in this building next to us and back through the process. So we would be trying to make. So these long kind of tube units that you see here, they're called shell and tube exchangers. And they were used in the heating and cooling process. When we get to one of the other buildings, I have a better picture for you, but inside there is a tube bundle. So a whole bunch of little tubes. So we could put the product through the tubes, and then the void space around the outside, we could put steam or water, depending on whether we're heating or cooling in our process. So nowadays, you may see big fans, there would be different processes used, but at that time, in 1933, and the number of years after, that was how they would heat and cool things in processes. So this tank was replaced in the 70s. That's why something would have happened to the original tank, and they replaced it at that time. It's called redundancy. So we are producing gas eventually that is going into people's furnaces. We have a steady stream of people wanting our products that we're making, so we never want the tank to go down. So if one of these breaks and needs repair, we put the other one on.
Okay.
If we're doing regular maintenance in the plant, we would turn one off and turn the other one on. We've always got 2. Extremely hot in the summers in here and very cold in the winters. Because as you can see, the corrugated tin is not going to retain much heat. And that we talked about the layers of bubble cap trays that are within all of these towers. This is a good spot to note. All of these tanks are from 1933. You can see they're all riveted together. Yeah. But we know this one was added later, this tower, because it's welded. It says cream steel. Yes. And it has a symbol on it. So there's all kinds of stories about why that symbol is here. There's 3 of them left on site that have that marking. But the real story is this plant was built in the early 30s. Okay. When that symbol was stamped on that product was made by Cream Steel in the United States. And that symbol at that time was used a lot. It's a Hindu symbol, goes back thousands of years, and it meant wealth and prosperity. So along come the 40s and Mr. Hitler, and now it means what we know it to mean today. But when this plant was put together, that is not what the symbol meant. Those are not products of Germany or made in Germany. They were made right in the United States.
I remember reading up on that this symbol has a complete different meaning.
Yeah.
And really just about the opposite than what it is.
Yeah, it's a symbol that's
today.
Thousands of years old, apparently. So there are 3 locations where we still see that symbol on some of the valves and things in the plant. And there are locations where they've been ground away, because when the workers came back after the war, of course they didn't want to look at that symbol. So there's valves outside. You can clearly see where they've taken a grinder and removed them. Times when they have to go and take samples and make sure that everything is working empty, then maintenance would be done. So there are manholes in them. In this one, the manhole where they would go in if they had to do any maintenance on the inside.
That would be not fun.
They still do, it happens even in today. You have to have training for it. It's called confined space entry. Yeah, it's quite a process. There's a number of safety features that are involved in order to do it. But I didn't notice on the other side of the video, real like clock pictures, many of them have the dates on it still. Some of them do in the next building, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in there. They're all busted in here, unfortunately. So that's what some of those, the ones with the peak roof are. Over on the other side for sure, I'm not 100% sure about these. So this is just another instance of being able to see all that riveting. And of course our symbol is on this joint as well. And if you look here, we can see where it was ground away.
Okay, so that's the original, and then the other one over here where they
had the same markings and symbol, and they removed it. Huge tank here. So we would draw water from the river, and we would fill 2 of those giant tanks.
Okay.
One of them was removed because it wasn't structurally sound anymore. But those would be filled with the water that we would use in our process. So it would gravity feed from up there down into the plant through all of our processes, and then it would be released back into the river.
You mean just straight ahead of us here?
Straight ahead and just over the hill there's Dingman number 2.
Okay.
It was abandoned safely, I think, in 2012, but they couldn't abandon it properly until 2012. They didn't have the technology. So even though they were using it, it was just, they ran a pipe out of the ground and lit it on fire. So up until 2010, when you visit Turner Valley, everybody talked about the dancing fire in the ditch. They put a fence around it, and the gas just came out and burned for years and years and years. Wow. And then in 2010, they finally had the technology to do what they needed to do to cap it, just like Dingman number 1. So if you watch the Ghostbusters Afterlife movie, the most recent Ghostbusters, most people haven't watched it, unless you're under 20 years old. It was filmed here on site, parts of it. So really? As we go around this bend, there is a scene in the movie, and if you go to YouTube and just do YouTube Turner Valley Gas Plant Ghostbusters Afterlife, it'll come up with the clips that are filmed here, so you don't have to watch the whole thing.
Oh, really?
But there's a shot where there's 2 young people practicing with proton packs firing at these tanks here, and you can clearly see that they're here on this site. This is the scrubbing plant. So we talked inside about H2S and the need to pull it away from the gas because it is toxic and poisonous.
Yeah.
So this is where we would do that process. So in these 5 towers at this end, there's 2 processes going on. Halfway up, the gas again is coming from the bottom. We've got that tray situation again. And we're adding a product halfway up called MEA, or monoethanolamine. Okay. Monoethanolamine draws away H2S. So that's its purpose. It goes in as lean MEA. When it hits the bottom, it's rich MEA. It's pulled out the H2S. Then it goes into the 2 towers over there that are called reactivators, where we heat it up and the MEA and the H2S separate. The MEA we keep using just like the lean oil again and again and again through the process. The sour gas at this point, the H2S is super, super concentrated. So we put it through the yellow piping, which is kind of rusty yellow now.
Yeah.
And it travels through that piping over to the sulfur plant where we make sulfur. So during you know, sulfur is used in weapons, like 1952, the Korean War was starting soon, or in that era. So we used it in that. It's used in the tea making process. It's used in the sugar making process. It's used in sulfur drugs, in pharmaceuticals. So it was shipped from here all over the world for various uses.
Didn't the old style matches, you know, the wood sticks, that was sulfur too, right? Yeah.
I think they were as well. So that's what's happening halfway up. The top of the tank, we still have the gas going up. In the top of the tank, we're adding glycol. The purpose of the glycol is to travel down and pull out any liquid that has kind of crept into our process as we've gone through everything that we've seen. So the glycol would come through, it would be sent to that little tiny metal building there, which is a glycol still, where we heat it up and we flash off the water. So
now, with that glycol, is that the glycol we use in the antifreeze still these days?
No, it would just be a product that we would have trucked in here and we'd use, and the glycol would be the same. It's just like the MEA and the lean oil. We use it over and over and over in the cycle, again and again. So the sulfur plant, we've got sulfur happening over there. We talked about what's happening. We're making propane, we're making butane, we're making absorption gasoline, we're making sulfur. And now, off the top of these 5 towers, the little black bubbles on the top, we are making sales gas for your furnace. And that would be natural gas for your furnace. So we've got 5 products that we're producing from that one thing that's spewing out of the ground.
Yeah.
And we're not processing any oil here. That's a whole different process and a whole different type of plant. Or facility, refinery, really. Oops, there's one. Right there. There he is. Oh, yeah. It's just over here in bright, bright blue. This is a good spot to see the piping underground and that it's coming from underground into this building. So the blue is water or steam. The orange is gas. The purple is the MEA we talked about outside.
Okay.
The green would be common for something in the process here.
And you said blue was water, right?
Water or steam.
Water or steam.
So if we look here, there's a key for the color coding. And we talked about the acid gas outside. We would be able to get samples from the process. So the workers in here would take little samples and run it to the lab, or they'd do little minor testing that they could do here to make sure the process was operating smoothly. There's a few here that survived and are still in working order. So how these would work is in the center, you would put a little key and you would have to wind them every 12 hours. They're basically a 12-hour clock. So you would wind that every 12 hours. You would change the sheet of paper that's in there. If you look behind me, you can see in the other gauges. Run to the office, and that would allow the management to know what exactly was going on in the process, how things were working. There would have been 3 pens involved. Blue, green, and red, I believe, were the colors of ink. And there's only 2 left here, but the worker would also have to make sure that those little pads were filled with ink regularly as well.
Now, the 3 different colors, were they matched to the colored pipe, but that was unrelated?
Probably unrelated.
Okay.
Yeah. They would just talk about probably flows in the process and manually and looking at gauges and very simple process. I love this because this tells me how simple some of this was. So this is an emergency shutdown switch. So this very high-tech piece of equipment here is what stops us from accidentally shutting down the process. So that's your shut-off switch.
Wow.
And this keeps you from doing it by accident. So not very high-tech, but very effective.
It worked.
That's right.
It worked.
Yeah.
You didn't have to study a manual first how to shut it down.
Exactly. So this is a tube bundle so that we can work on it, so we can make sure the tubes are all in good condition. We wouldn't want anything leaking because we've got something going through the tubes and then we've got something else through the void space. So we need to make sure they're maintained regularly. So that would have been the purpose of pulling those bundles out. water from the river would run through. So the odd time, I've been told by some of the old timers, they'd have to pull them and clean out the little trout that would get stuck.
Oh, really?
Or the sand, that type of thing. Basically, the 5 towers that we're running the MEA and the glycol through, and the natural gas are coming up are batteries. These are the reactivated towers that we talked about, where we're heating up that MEA with the H2S in it, separating those two. That takes place at this end of the scrubbing plant. Another example of the redundancy there.
Huh.
The 2 pieces, identical, doing the same job, but going in and out of service as needed for maintenance repairs. This is our emergency eye wash and shower station here. Very simple. And I'm told by people that have worked in plants that have been through recently that it's still very similar today. Not much has changed about that type of equipment, they tell me. Again, you can see where the manifold is, where if necessary, you could get in and do whatever maintenance you can get in there. You'll notice this is identical to that piece of equipment. These 2 pieces are identical. It's more of that redundancy.
It's very interesting. How long did it take you to do all of the systems?
Oh my goodness.
Or should I say technology?
I still learn more and more all the time. Because my husband works for a long time in helping with the process, I'm not that organized person. So I like to say I have a 10,000 foot level of what's going on in here. Very Christina. Of course, the weekend, if the weather is decent, we have 40, 50 go through, or 30, 50. If the weather is bad, not so many. There would have been a little, they'd have put some polyplastic up around some boards to give them a little warmth from that little bit of radiated heat there in the winter. In the summer, it would have been extremely hot. He wouldn't have needed it, but that would have been where he would stand. There's a little desk back here he would have used, managed and ran these plants.
5 workers for the whole plant, that's it?
Workers for these processes. So during a weekday, there might be 30 people on site. You'd have the management team in the office, you'd have maybe an assistant, you'd have maintenance folks that would come in, you might have a crew that comes in to paint pipe out there, that kind of thing. So there'd be about 30 people during a weekday, but only 5 of them were responsible for running the operation, and 1 in each building.
Quite amazing if you look at the size of it and all the stuff.
Yeah, and imagine, each of these has to be wound every 12 hours, you're replacing your ink, you're replacing your paper, you'd be busy. And back in the day, and it started in the 30s, this also is 1933, they didn't sit. It was frowned upon to sit at work, so you're on your feet that whole time. This is the compressor building. So the gas comes in from the field to this building first.
Okay.
It comes in to these 2 units on either end, and those knock out any liquids or solids. Then it goes into the compressor building where it's compressed up to 350 psi. So it takes us 350 psi to push the gas from the field through all of the processes that we just walked through and talked about. The reason that we have to use these compressors is because when we were inside the light plant, I told you about all of the flaring. So when they were flaring, they were reducing the pressure in the field. So the field pressure was only at 50 psi. So that was why we needed the compressors. So we started with 3 at this end of the building, and then as demand increased and time went on, we added more, and we kept adding them that way until we had 10 compressor units.
Okay.
Pipes that go in,
Yeah.
you can see these ones are closer than the others. That would have gone to the original compressors that went in. So we know the oldest compressors that went in the early 30s are at this end of the building. And as we go that way, they get newer, but not that new, of course. So all of these is gas going into the compressors.
Huh.
It's running on natural gas. And those engines are driving the compressors that are attached. There are 2 compressors to each engine. So that's what you're looking at when you look at one of these units.
Now you may have mentioned, not sure you said, to 350 psi. Now, is that number, how did we arrive on that number? Do you know?
That's the number that is required in order to push the gas through all of the processes we walked through.
Okay.
It needs that much pressure to move it through all of that. So that's how we arrived at that figure. So if we look at this picture, it was taken in the 40s. And we can see this would have been one of the workers at that time period. He's standing at that kind of oiling system that's over there in the engine. You can see that he's probably adjusting or pushing something on those buttons over there. So they would have been dressed in a very tidy fashion. You wouldn't think of coming to work here in that time period with a rip in your pants or something, or with dirty clothing on. It was seen as a prestigious job to work here, and it would have been unacceptable to show up here not dressed appropriately for the job. This building would have been spotless. The floor would have been painted. There would not have been a drop of oil anywhere. There would have been constant cleaning going on, and it would have just sparkled. Here you could have eaten off the floor.
Which is quite amazing if you look at the machinery.
Yeah. Go in there. There's some soundproofing tiles in there, and that would probably be the only place where you can hear anything.
Wow, that noisy.
It would have been very loud. Right now, we can hear 3 compressor units running in the building next door, and it's kind of muffled because we're indoors.
Yeah.
So imagine 10 of them running.
Just imagine the noise in here.
The noise would have been just unbelievable. So if we walk around the back here, we'll be able to see we've taken one of the engines off the top, so you can take a little bit of a look inside.
Holy smoke.
This one we've had the engine removed from the top. So as I said, they're made by Bessemer. And what I've been told is that they were really reliable and they ran really well, but they were a bit difficult to start when they went down. So if they went down, you would push a button to start them, but all of the pistons would have to kind of line up in a certain way so the airflow was happening correctly. If that wasn't happening, it wouldn't start.
Okay.
So if it didn't start, you would put what's called a snipe on the end of here, a long pipe, and as the worker, you'd look at the notches and you would move it 1 notch. And this weighs hundreds of pounds.
Wow.
So it was a very manual labor. So you would move that 1 notch and you would try again. And if it didn't start, you would move it another notch. So if 4 of these went down in a day, you probably went home one really tired guy.
Wow. So they would run 24/7 unless there was some kind of an issue that they stopped.
Yeah. And there would have been times where they would shut 1 or 2 or 3 down to maintenance or something, but they would run fairly steady. If all of these went down, then we have no compressors, we have no flow through the plant.
You have a problem,
We're not making any money as the company that owns it. We've got people in Calgary who aren't getting the natural gas we promised them, so. Yeah. See coming off each one of these mufflers. Every one of them has a big muffler coming off a little bit and kind of tone down the noise a little bit. But the noise here would have been unbelievable. I'm sure there were probably a generation who lost their hearing. But my husband, who worked here, told me that the older folks he worked with, the older men that were training him, were very clear to always wear your hearing protection. And he said, I always listened. So he has no hearing issues, fortunately. But there's also stories that I've heard where some of the workers didn't like to wear the hearing protection because they were so in tune with these engines and machines and the noises that they made when they were working correctly that they wanted to take their hearing protection off so they could hear if something was wrong with the unit.
So they could hear if something is wrong, but in the process they lost their hearing eventually.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm sure there was some definite hearing loss in the early days before the standards were improved. remediation work. So in underground there is something called the Old Valley Line. So there was a gas line and some underground tanks there, and they're just digging those out and remediating and cleaning up the site. So one of the things that I like to mention is you cannot put a subdivision within 50 meters of one of those old abandoned wells. So if you look around, the town's kind of spread out, kind of weird. That's probably why. There's probably some abandoned wells or some abandoned piping underground, so we can't use certain plots of land. So as we move forward, they're cleaning things up so that we're going to be able to, have more of that usable space. But at this point, it's merely a case of pulling pipes out of the ground for the most part. But I would love to answer any questions if you have any, and you're more than welcome to go back into the light plant. I think Daryl is still in there. If you have any questions for someone that used to work here,
Okay.
I'm happy to accommodate that as well.
Perfect. Well, I want to say thank you very much. It was very informative for us.